Hej och välkommen till Teknikpodden. Det här är en podd som handlar om allting som har med techrekrytering att göra. En hel del om ledarskap inom techsektorn och en och annan digital spaning kring vart världen är på väg i övrigt. Som den vanliga lyssnaren vid det här laget vet. Jag är tillbaka den här veckan efter att ha tagit en veckas semester förra veckan. Småjobbade lite grann, men framförallt lyckades jag åka lite skidor i Österrike. Och vandrade upp och ner i bergen där. Och då var det inte här hemska som hände i Örebro inträffade. Och jag tycker att man är, även om man har följt det på håll, kan man låta bli väldigt drabbad av det som händer när det är så pass nära. Jag tycker inte att jag är bättre på att formulera känsla kring det här än någon annan, utan känner en oerhört stor sorg tycker jag när man sådana här saker inträffar. Och en meningslöshet i alltihop. Svårt att förstå varför och på vilket sätt och så. Så att jag vill bara säga det att jag som alla andra, särskilt om man som jag har en bakgrund söder om Örebro, så kan man ju inte bli att tänka på allt som har hänt. Men den podden som idag spelas in är något helt annat. Det är med Jacob Zentio Larsen. En av de bästa chefer tycker jag som jag har träffat genom åren, som vi jobbade mycket med när jag jobbade på Global Connect. Och han var alltid väldigt klok kring hur han resonerade kring sina egna ledarrekryteringar. Klok kring hur han resonerade kring vart branschen och världen var på väg. Så att jag är väldigt glad att du tog dig tid att ha ett samtal med oss, Jacob, för dina insikter i både telekom och även inte minst i den sektor som du själv är på väg in i, den gröna sektorn. Så att det här är ett klokt samtal med en bra ledare inom tech och telekom. För er som är i de här transition-faserna så är det här också ett jättespännande avsnitt. Developers. So very nice to see you, Jacob.
Thank you very much.
We just said it, I just realized we've never met physically.
No.
So it's good to see you. I think you're above and beyond expectation.
Thank you.
So what does it feel like to be, preparing or getting, starting the pod?
I think, as you know, I've been listening to the last few ones just to get my mindset on, and every podcast format is different, right? But I've been setting my mind on the mapping into this, and I'm super excited. But then again, when you're sitting in the chair, you're a little anxious, and on one side it's super easy to talk about yourself, but you obviously need to highlight the things that other people find interesting and find relevant for them and their careers, right? So, but I'm super excited to be here.
Should we just say so? I've been trying a new thing. I think you've seen that I've sort of trying to ask people what's your top of mind at the moment.
Yeah.
Do you want to say something about what you're sort of thinking about this week?
I think top of mind for me, and this is also because I'm passionate about this, is on one side, I think there's a lot happening in telco that all of a sudden has become extremely relevant for everybody. And I'm thinking obviously about critical infrastructure, sea cables, land cables, that have been cut, and so on and so forth. And I'm also very keenly aware as an insider just how misunderstood parts of this problem is, right? So when you read about it in the media, it seems super simple, but it's really far more complicated than that.
Can you just give an example what you mean by that?
That's so let me. So the view is that this is national critical infrastructure, whether it's the sea cables or the gas cables or the electricity cables, that we should really hide where they are. And that's the prevailing notion, because there are examples of, is it Russian ships and a Chinese ship that have cut these cables, right? And the problem is that narrative is very simple, it's easy to understand, but it's an inaccurate narrative. The narrative is that there are fishing vessels, there are drenching vessels, there are vessels that dig in the harbors or near shore and so on and so forth, and they need to know exactly where those cables are.
That's a good point.
The same thing about the infrastructure, the digital infrastructure on land. We need to know exactly where that is, not just that it's running out in Sveavägen, but exactly where it is on Sveavägen, exactly where it comes in, because as you could see right outside your building here, people are building, right? And that is missed. So how do you make this information easily accessible on one side so you don't have all of these inadvertent, but again, innocent cable cuts. But on the same time, you need to be able to obviously not disclose that information to people who have bad intentions, right? And that is the difficult conversation to be had, but in the public media, we go to the easy conversation instead.
And we're going to come to why you know a lot about this. But,
Yes.
but do you have any? I mean, do you have any answers to that? I mean,
I think, unfortunately, that my view is that the long-range view has to be that we need to disclose exactly where these cables are.
And how do you balance that with sort of the protection security side?
Exactly. And then you need to do redundancy, which is expensive. You need to do, obviously, become good friends with people that have bad intentions and so on and so forth, right? And not necessarily just let them sail away. So these things, and the irony is that if you take an example, if you have a cable cut of an undersea cable cut, then they pay for the damages. Yeah. This isn't happening this time because now it's all part of a geopolitical picture and so on and so forth, right? So we had a cable cut between Malmö and Copenhagen. A ship threw their anchor and as part of the normal sort of swaying of waves, the anchor dragged and cut the cable. Now, they paid for those damages. We haven't done that in these cases for a variety of reasons, but all of a sudden it becomes this big geopolitical thing, which I think we need to find a way to address.
So why don't we sort of start to who you are and why you're here? And start with you. And let's sort of there's so much to talk about, Jacob, but and I must say I really look forward to this. But maybe you could just sort of give me some. I mean, say a little about your experience, but also then sort of maybe some things which have sort of brought you to where you are.
Yeah. So the short answer to, and there isn't necessarily a short answer, but the short answer is up until recently, I was the CIO and CTO, so CTIO of Global Connect. And if people don't know, I think for your audience, they know, most of them would know IP Only. IP Only was a division of Global Connect, and now everything has been rebranded to Global Connect. And Global Connect is, among other things, a carrier's carrier that carries about 50% of all the internet, or more than 50% of all the internet traffic that flows into the Nordic region. Okay.
So, and you've really had it before that, had a long career in telco. I mean,
I've had a 27-year career in telco, and for the time being, that's on hold. But we'll get to that over the course of.
And can you just say something about sort of what sort of those 26 years? What happened? And what happened to you?
So my history, if you want to go back, and I'll do this super brief, is I was born in Denmark, the son of an expat family, and therefore I've lived most of my life outside of Denmark. I was born in Denmark, but then we moved to Switzerland, then to France, then back to Denmark. And having been exposed to being abroad, I've also studied abroad. So I've studied obviously in Denmark and France, but also in the UK, in the US. And professionally, I am a business undergraduate. And after my bachelor's degree, I decided I didn't want to automatically continue on and take my master's. So and this was in hindsight stupid, but ended up being a good experience, because at the time, the economy was relatively weak in Denmark, and I probably sent out 50 or 60 letters to different companies, and I tried everything. And finally, the Danish Ministry of Foreign Affairs said, we're looking for somebody to be trade secretary in Buenos Aires in Argentina. So my first job out of the Copenhagen Business School was I went and worked for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs for 2 years in Argentina.
Wow. That's interesting. Do you have any take on the recent development?
So I have to say I fell in love with Argentina, and I had the good years in Argentina when the economy was growing.
When was this?
This was in the early 90s. I had really the good years in Argentina. The currency was pegged to the dollar. The economy grew. They opened up everything. And then that was a very brief period that lasted maybe a handful of years. And then things have been on a slide ever since, right? Up until recently, believe it or not.
It's funny how this recently, we talk for hours about this, but what are your friends? Do you have any Argentinian friends?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. Absolutely. And I think two things at the same time. One is people have really seen their country slide, and it is as beautiful as you see on the postcards. But if you look at the buildings, if you look at the architecture and so on and so forth, it's very clear that it's been on a downward slide. And I think now they're doing everything that we know needs to happen, right? So trying to stop corruption, trying to open up, trying to sort of get away from nepotism, trying to shrink the public sector, and so on and so forth, right? And so far, and I just saw that in the news today, it looks like it's really working.
Yeah, there's suddenly people are being quite positive. I mean, inflation is still pretty high, but it's still interesting. I think Argentina is really interesting because, like you said, it's one of those countries which is sort of. I mean, if you go even further back, they were doing really well. Like 100 years ago, it was one of the richest countries in the world per capita, and then they had like a terrible 100 years of. I mean, a lot of other countries had terrible 20th centuries, but they're still doing. They're sort of. I think they're at 63rd place or 64th place in the wealth league at the moment, compared to 4th or 5th. Or a little bit, depending how you measure.
Yeah, exactly.
So it's interesting. But how did you transition from that to telecom?
I think it was when I was in Argentina, it was very obvious that I didn't want to work in the public sector. Okay. Even though the embassy in Buenos Aires really had a super, super strong esprit de corps, we were building something, right? Because it went from being just you could say diplomatic representation, and then we opened the trade department, and there was lots of trade between Denmark and Argentina, and that was really growing. So Denmark got a sizable chunk of the economic growth in Argentina, obviously adjusted for the size of Denmark. But it was super interesting there. But I didn't want to continue in diplomacy. But what inspired me in Argentina is to see American companies move in. And, when the market deregulated, American companies would just come in and buy the local competitor or set up an office with 100 people. And this was in the mid-90s at this point. And it was very, very popular at the time, everything with the top 10 MBAs. We were hearing all about these Ivy League MBAs. The Harvard case study methodology was starting to make its way into Europe, into European business schools and so on. And I was like, okay, I had done a summer school program at Harvard when I was in high school. So I had a little bit a taste of the American school system and just how ambitious it can be. And I thought I would try that. So I went to the US. I got accepted into one of these top 10 programs. And when I went to the US for my wife and I, it was always with the ambition that once I was done, we wanted to stay in the United States. Okay. When I was done with my MBA, a lot of people obviously go into management consulting. A lot of people go into banking.
Where did you go in the US? Where did you?
I went to Dartmouth, so one of the smaller Ivy Leagues. But I can say with a certain pride, and maybe we'll get back to this in the podcast also, it's very way up north, and it's also, to the best of my knowledge, the only Ivy League that has its own ski area. And I'm super passionate about skiing.
Was that a good experience? I mean, did you?
It was a super good experience. I had a really, really good experience. Academically, socially, great exposure to nature. The nature. Dartmouth is in New Hampshire. Is in New England.
Classic.
Exactly. So I really wanted the classic experience. And the first year, I stayed in the dorm. To really try to live on campus and so on and so forth. So I wanted that experience for sure.
And looking back, have you had? There's a lot of talk now that American universities, they charge you a lot of money, and was it worth it looking back?
Yes. So without a doubt, and I think there are calculations out there that say that if you go to one of these top 10 programs, unless you sort of go out and get a great job, then actually there's no return on investment. You're better off not putting yourself in debt and working for 2 years, right? For me personally, there is no doubt whatsoever that that's been a good investment. But to me, it's not just the math of the economics, so to say. It was also just a great experience. And it was an introduction to the American high-tech sector. When I was done, I didn't want to do management consulting. I didn't want to do investment banking. I really wanted to go into industry. And telecom at the time, and we have to remember, this was sort of, I don't want to say the beginning of the wave, but the wave had already started in terms of the internet and so on and so forth. AOL, Yahoo, Netscape, those companies were like super hot companies. Everybody was talking about that. But I was more attracted to the networking side, to the hardware side than the service side, if you like. So I ended up working for Lucent Technologies, or Bell Labs and Lucent Technologies. But also here I chose, or we, my wife and I, chose with our heart, because we wanted to live in Manhattan. And I could live in Manhattan and then commute out to New Jersey.
Which years were this? What were the years in
so this was, I graduated in 97, and we ended up staying in the US for 2 years for the MBA and an additional 12 years, living, 7 of them living in Manhattan and the rest of them
What's
living
the big takeaways? Obviously you were there at 9/11 and everything, the whole...
I was there 9/11. We lived 14 blocks away from the World Trade Center. We were locked into Manhattan for the days when there was a lockdown on Manhattan. Yes, absolutely.
What are your sort of big takeaways from those years? Sort of?
I think the big takeaway is 2 things. One is the whole energy, let's try something out, let's just do it, and so on. And again, this has now in IT and in different versions converted into the agile mindset, has converted into the fail fast mindset, and so on. And we didn't necessarily have those labels at the time, but at Lucent Technologies, at Bell Labs, you would do 100 projects easily and then expect maybe only 20 of them to succeed, right? But that was the nature of things. And everybody was okay with that. And if something failed, you would either try to reuse the technology or just outright close it down. And I think the advent, the growth, and so on and so forth, all the things that we take for granted now, fiber communications, everybody takes that for granted. I didn't understand the technology. I'm a business undergraduate. I'm a business graduate. So I didn't understand the technology. I had to learn that as I was working. I had to do, obviously put in the hours, but learn the technology in parallel. But I have to say, these are things that we take for granted today. Most houses in Sweden today are penetrated by fiber. When I started in telecom, ironically in the optical networking division, working with fiber, this was something that was deep in the backbone, right? This was the big stuff, right? So that's one thing that I've learned, the whole let's try and fail, let's just try and so things. The other thing that I learned is to be super skeptical about this growth narrative. So I still meet it among investors. I still meet it among, you can say, industry analysts that say, well, bandwidth continues to grow. Therefore, there's going to be money. People are going to invest and so on and so forth. And look at where we are today, right? Most telcos have had to invest in the 5G upgrade. They've had to convert from copper or from coax to fiber and so on. And they are really, really heavily bogged down by the size of those investments, right? So the investment narrative that would convert into automatic growth for the companies that made the investment, I've been super skeptical by that.
Before we dive into telecommunications properly, can you just say something? I mean, looking now, having had this big US experience, I mean, those are very sort of formative years. I mean, it's always like that when you look back, we sort of say, oh, all this happened, and it was fantastic. But of course, at the time, I know there's a lot of talk about, the problems in the US as now. But I mean, at the moment, also there's a big debate. European competitiveness, Nordic competitiveness contra the US competitiveness. Things going. How are they going to go? What's your take on sort of US tech contra European tech, and what sort of?
I think the question is really Western tech versus Chinese tech.
Interesting.
If we take the digital sector, the US is dominant. Okay, and
what's the key? Why are they keep succeeding? What's sort of what the US?
I think, quite frankly, the CEO of Cognic, who was on your podcast, really hit the nail on the head. It's just a mindset.
Yeah,
it's just a mindset. They are all in. And I forget what the author's name is, but he wrote a book called The Tower and the Square. And the CEO of Cognic highlighted this dilemma where in Europe we're super consumed by saying, if we're going to do something digital, we have to do it the right way. This professor who wrote The Tower and the Square says what's happening in the US is they're doing it and they know they're going to get it wrong. They know that they're going to have data violations. They know they're going to have all of this fake news and so on and so forth. It's really the digital communication that he's commenting on. He says, but eventually they actually fix it. So he's super optimistic on behalf of the US tech companies, even though he's clear about that they're doing all kinds of violations right now. And that's not the way that we're doing it in Europe. We want to get it right before we sort of do it, right? So we want to have it thought through. And today, this is another topic that we get wrong all the time. We're so focused on fake news, but our data is going to the US. Our data is going to China. Nobody's doing anything about it, right? And we're talking, 1 or 2 sea cables, but the truth is all Europeans' data is going everywhere and we have no idea where this is going, right? So another way, and I'm not saying it's one or the other that we need to fix, but sometimes I think we tend to be a little myopic on the problems that we're trying to fix.
What do you mean by that?
So what I mean specifically by that is that we're concerned about cutting certain cables. And yes, that does impact people, just as an example. And I could have chosen other examples. But the reality is all the data that goes in on Facebook, on whatever it is, Google, that goes on TikTok, that goes on so on and so forth, is traveling the world. Mm. Right? And we know we have GDPR, we know that it's not permitted, but it does nonetheless, right? But it's too difficult to tackle that, so we'll just focus on the problems that are easier to focus on. That's what I mean by being a little too myopic, okay?
And so long term, are you US positive? I mean,
I'm super positive.
Yeah, I am as well, actually.
I am super, super positive. And just to be clear, my narrative is not just, Trump is only here for 4 years, because I don't think that, I think he's the tip of the iceberg. And I think the fact that he was elected with such an overwhelming majority really shows that there is something going on.
Definitely. There's some kind of change.
Exactly.
Of course, it's not a, it's easy because, of course, they could take a few 100,000 voters and it would have gone the other way.
Yeah.
But having said that, there is definitely, it wasn't like a 2016 fluke thing. It was
no. But I think also, and this is another thing which I think we need to have a conversation about, is MAGA is also a misnomer, because what he is so focused on is making America. He's saying great, but my purview is that he's making America industrial again. Right? And again, this is something that's obviously for his voters, that is meant to cater to the voters. And you see that I think that's very, very clear. But do we really need America to be industrial? Is that what is going to ensure competitiveness going forward? Right? I'm not so sure. Okay, I think if he had said, let's make America competitive again, there would be far more focus on the digital sector. There would be far more focus on all the things that America is already doing great, doing more of those. Okay, and I think the problem with that is that it really requires to fix education, basic education, because you go to Silicon Valley, you go to Boston, and you go to the whole area around Boston, around MIT, around Harvard, and so on and so forth. And what you see there is it's just filled with the brightest people from all over the world.
Yeah, but I mean, that's what makes it so positive about the US. They still have this ability to attract people.
Absolutely.
And it's sort of like the politicians it's going to be fine as long as they don't have a war with themselves.
Yeah,
which could happen, of course. It has happened before, and it can happen again. That will be a disaster. But as long as they do that, they'll be fine.
Yeah.
But just a quick before I go, Zaya. So just interested in your take on New York. How's New York doing now? Have you sort of friends? Have you got any friends still there?
Yeah.
Are they sort of I mean, there's been this sort of negative trend talk about the last 3 or 4 years. Is that sort of turning around? Or is
I think so. The economy on the coasts are doing well. Not obviously barring fires in LA, but the economies on the coasts are doing really well in the US. Okay, and that is also very much showing up. Washington, New York, Boston.
So it's sort of like it always is. It seems to bounce back, and it's sort of
and people are sort of deeply concerned with homeless people everywhere. So when I talk,
that's a big thing, isn't it?
It's a really, really, really big thing, and I know that there is an immigration pro-con immigration narrative, and I think most people who are super pro-immigration would even say that it's not necessarily the right type of immigrants that they have gotten if they are sleeping on the sidewalk. Okay, so there is a need for a hard look at the American society in the sense that we need to make sure that obviously the wealth is spread more evenly, which is not a very popular topic.
Back to yourself. How did you then transition? When did you decide to sort of move back to the Nordics?
I thankfully, for the past 27 years, I've been in telecommunications, and my journey from the US back to Denmark when I came to Denmark, I came to TDC.
And was that a professional choice, or was it sort of a person's?
No, it was purely so. Going to TDC was a professional choice, but moving back to Denmark was very much a personal choice.
Yeah, so it was like you decided you want to move.
My wife and I, we only have one child. Our son was 5 at the time, and we're like, this is the time we want him to be Danish. So,
as in you sort of said, if we stay, he's going to be
American. Yeah, he's going to be.
Why was that important? I mean,
that was just the way we felt. So, and grandparents and the whole.
I would have felt the same.
Yeah. So lifestyle is really, really nice in the Nordics, without a doubt. So we wanted to come back. And TDC at the time was owned by 4 or 5 private equity firms.
It's a question in a kind of professional way. Did you feel that moving back, did you sort of, were your American experiences appreciated so that you felt that it was sort of, you were a good...
I have to say, I was introduced to TDC through one of the private equity firms, and they knew me from New York.
So you had sort of...
And my job interview with TDC lasted 27 minutes. So they were like, hey...
And why did you choose that? You have to say something about TDC, because it's sort of...
TDC is the Telia of Denmark. It's the national incumbent. And they were, as I mentioned, privately held at the time, and were sort of undergoing a massive transformation from being a stodgy government or state-owned telco to something that the private equity firms could eventually introduce on the Copenhagen Stock Exchange and sell and obviously recoup their investment. And it was a super interesting journey. Without a doubt, anyone that was part of that journey would say that this was really, really interesting to do that. And shortly after I came back to Denmark, they were introduced on the Copenhagen Stock Exchange. And for the first 3 or 4 years, they were the best, could be 2-3 years, something in that neighborhood. They were the best performing telco in all of Europe.
And how did that go into Global Connect? How did that happen?
Well, so before I went to Global Connect, I was offered a position at what is today Norlys. And it was my opportunity to become, it was the first time I got a C-level job offered. So Norlys was looking for a CTO.
Tell me, what do they do?
Yeah, so Norlys is a utility-owned So it's a cooperative that has an energy utility and a telco. So it has two business areas. They've since branched out, but at the time they had a utility and a telco. And Norlys approached me and offered me to be CTO. But I had a non-compete clause with a TDC, which prevented me for 12 months to assume the CTO role. And then through some legal finagling and an agreement between the two CEOs, Norlys convinced TDC that I'd never been a CIO, and therefore I could assume the role of CIO at Norlys immediately, and that wouldn't violate any non-compete clause. And that was how I entered IT.
Yeah. Oh, that was the first IT role.
That was my first IT role.
That's interesting.
So
that's quite unusual in that sense.
It's super unusual.
Yeah.
And so in the US, 12 years, I've been working with the hardware. I had 7.5 years at TDC working with an operator. So I had to sort of change my mindset to now go and work for an operator. And now all of a sudden I found myself in IT. And that to me was incredibly rewarding. But also, I would say, super tough.
Yeah. So what was the big mistakes / big?
I think, quite frankly, and I really thought about it because obviously I knew I would be sitting in this chair today. And when you listen to, you've had so many people in this chair that have talked about their way into IT. And it sounds awfully rosy to me, I have to say. Well, yeah. And I have to say, probably, you know, I don't want it makes no point to talk about this or that system because they're different at all companies, right? But I think two things that really, really surprised me is just how interconnected this or that system is. So that if you try to do something in one system, you have all of these dependencies. And think about it, I came from networking, so I know that there are dependencies, but the degree of dependencies that you have in IT compared to what you have in networking is orders of magnitude. Integration, customization, done your own stuff, internally developed, all the stuff that all your listeners know because they live it every day, right? That was a huge surprise to me. I think the other thing that really surprised me is, and again, think about it, I came from networking, but network equipment, once it gets past 9, 10, 11 years, the silicon, the soldering on the silicon just dies, so you need to change it. But in IT, you know, servers will keep running. Now you can replace the server, but the software will keep running. You have operating systems that are end of sale, end of support, and so on and so forth. So the legacy, the amount of legacy is just inconceivable, right? So those were sort of hard-earned learnings for me there. But I was still super, and I can say this to this day today, really, really excited. I was brought on because Norlys wanted to do a digital transformation. They wanted to change the billing system in a number of their divisions. And we set off to do that. And in the operator, they're still working that project. So this was back in 2017, we set off on that journey. But in two of the three divisions, they changed that. And we changed ERP, we changed CRM, and so on and so forth.
Really some classic IT projects, I mean,
For sure, and super rewarding
And
projects.
what was your sort of learnings? What do you sort of bring, what do you sort of take with you? I mean, and I'm thinking also from other CEOs, other CIOs in those roles, what was sort of would anything you've done differently or that you sort of...
What I take with me first and foremost is just how active the CIO needs to be vis-a-vis the external stakeholders. People will always describe these projects as IT projects. And I keep telling everybody all of my stakeholders, IT couldn't care less. 100 systems, we're happy. 5 systems, we're happy. obviously I'm an executive, or I have been an executive all along. So I'm not trying to absolve myself, but we're not doing this for IT's sake. This is really to help the business, right? At Global Connect, we put in one CRM because the number of customers that we had that were in many countries meant that we couldn't have, the customers are like, how come you can't see what I'm doing? I'm calling you from Denmark, but you can't see what I'm doing in Norway. We're like, well, it's in a different system. And they're like, see if I care, right? So these things, if you can't explain them to customers, you need to do something about it, but don't do it for IT's sake. Do it for the business, right?
I mean, that's interesting because that's something I think a lot of people work with. But how do you sort of work to avoid that sort of introverted feeling in an organization? What do you do, or what can you do as a CIO or a CTO?
In Danish, we have an expression. I'll translate it directly. It means that you need to go out on the beer box and talk to your stakeholders, talk to their employees, so on and so forth. So it's all about communication. It's all about alignment. It's all about involvement, right? When you tell somebody, I'm happy to deliver you a new system, but your people are the ones who are going to be doing most of the work, because you need to set the requirements. You need to streamline the processes and so on. When I joined Global Connect, they had proposed a new ERP. And there was a new CFO, he joined a month before I did, and IT had made a recommendation. And I said, let's choose this system. And I said, it makes no sense to me. And they were deeply surprised, but I think also saddened, because they had hoped that there would be a strong CIO that would come in and say, that's the right choice for ERP. And I turned around to the CFO and I said, which processes do you want? Then I'll tell you which system you want to use. Right? It's not about the system. You can use Dynamics 365, you can use IFS, a Swedish system. Both of them are great, but it doesn't really matter. You can use any one of these. Tell me what processes you want to put in. Which country do you want to model this after? How do you want to run your business? If you can tell me that, I'll tell you which system is great. But you can't do it the other way around, right? It's like if you were to buy a new car and you said, which car should I get? And I'm like, what do you want? Right? Do you want a sporty two-seater? Do you want an SUV? Do you want an electrical car? Do you want a diesel car? It's the same thing in IT, right? And it's not about IT. So that was really, really a lesson. And thankfully at Norlys, we had a CEO that was super supportive, okay? He was very concerned about the company being bogged down by this IT legacy, that he kept sort of raising the issue, making sure that people were aligned. So I had a lot of help at Norlys there, and I'm super, super thankful for that.
And to be even more specific there, I think the whole legacy thing is, of course, something that is growing. I mean, IT is so much bigger now than it was even 10 years ago. So almost all companies have this sort of, and Telekom is, of course, was very early with this, and the banks are the same, but also now lots of, how do you, I mean, do you have any sort of ideas how do you avoid getting long-term bogged down? Is that I realize it's a massive question, but if you sort of, what's your sort of take on what a good CIO or a CTO has to handle this situation?
I think the number one challenge to get there is to really convince your stakeholders that you don't have an IT-centric agenda. We're not doing this because of IT. We're doing this because the business will start to suffer. And if you can convince management of that, then you need their help to convince their people. I heard the old CEO of one of the two companies that merged into what became Norlys said, the best way to get anyone to fall in love with a system they hate is by telling them that you're going to take it away. Right? And I've experienced this so many times in my life. Everybody is like, oh, we need a digital transformation, we need a new web shop, we need a new fill in the blank of IT system. And then the moment you tell them, okay, we heard what you said, we're now going to replace this system, everybody immediately falls in love with it. So those are the two bridges that you need to cross. And then the rest is just a lot of hard work, right? And as everybody have said who's been in this chair, there are going to be lots of stumbling blocks along the way. There are going to be lots of challenges. Integration is not going to go as smoothly. Working with the data, you're going to need to tweak the data to get it to work in the system. But all of that is just hard work. The other things is something that the CIO personally plays a big role in crossing those bridges. Okay.
And do you have any sort of organizational idea? I mean, because of course that one way to see it is that you can organize yourselves in a way which sort of promotes the kind of customer-centric thinking, but you could also say, you know, and also lots of examples of IT organizations that sort of become. What's your? I mean, having lived this for the last 26 years, but what's your take on what works and what doesn't work?
And I'll repeat what many who have said in this chair. It starts with a team. You need to have the right team. Nobody's going to cross those two bridges with you, so speaking figuratively, if they don't have faith in the team around you. Okay? And not just in the CIO, but in the team around you. They're going to put their faith in you, in that you can guide them along the way. So it's really about the ability of the team to bring your other stakeholders, employees along on the journey as well. I think that's one thing. The other thing is that day to day, for most employees in IT, is looking at the systems. And you need to turn their gaze away from just the systems. Of course, they need to continue to patch and to maintain and to blah, 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 all of that, right? But you really turn their gaze towards the business. And I have to say that I've always, in my leadership assessment, in my management assessment of people, I've worked on two dimensions. One dimension, which is how well do you know your fill in the blank? How well do you know finance? How well do you know IT? How well do you know the subject, the topic that you're working, the system that you're working? And when you meet with most people in IT, they're very fluent in sort of moving up and down. They want the next certification. They want to get more proficient in their system. The other dimension is the interpersonal dimension. How good are you at communicating? How good are you at aligning? How good are you in creating solutions when there are problems and things like that? And a lot of people, not all, and certainly not with the advent of Agile and other things like that, were quite uncomfortable moving on that dimension. And that goes for management as well. And unfortunately, in many cases, more so for management that came out of a deeply technical background or a deeply sort of a content-driven background. It's the same in the medicinal industry. It's the same at a university hospital or any kind of hospital, right? But so I've had to work both with my management team, with my employees, to lift them on the interpersonal dimension.
And how do you do that? And how do you? What works do you find?
I think it's about the honest dialogue. People come in to their quarterly, to their one-to-ones, and want to talk about a bullet list of practical things, this system, that we need to, and you're like, yeah, okay, but you need to add that into the bi-weekly one-to-ones. You need to add that into the performance appraisals and so on. And you can sit there and look at a system owner, and they're like, I'm looking for this next certification. I'd like to, so on and so forth. And I'm like, I support you 100% in doing that. And oh, by the way, you need to work on your communication skills. And you can just see that there is you're sending, there is no reception of that message. And it's a journey, I would say that.
And anything you can do to make it quicker, or you've seen this sort of worked, this is something or all this hasn't worked?
Yes, there is a way of doing this quicker, and that's being crystal clear about that, how you, that is what you're expecting. Okay, really, in Danish we have an expression that would translate well into Swedish: overtydelig. Just be more than clear that this is what is expected. Okay, and I've had employees that I've had to repeat the same message 4 or 5 times before they would even take the first baby step.
So so where are we now with having now decided to, I think you're sort of on the verge of, you have left Global Connect, but you're
so
you're also,
after 3.5 years I left Global Connect, and I think also breaking the mold of what you've of the people that you've had in this chair, my exit of Global Connect is interesting in the sense that two things happened after I was at Global Connect nearly 4 years. We were struggling to get enough people to fully staff both operations and technology. And therefore, we had repeatedly sort of said to the board, we need to look at a different way of organizing ourselves. And I was CTIO at the time, so I had both technology and IT. And between the COO and me as CTO, we had simply trouble doing what we wanted to do, what we could fund with the CapEx, because we didn't have enough people. And eventually, the board said, you know what, you're right, we need to sort of merge those two organizations. And two executives became one, and one of us had to leave, and I was the one who had to leave. In IT, the board also said that they wanted a fresh pair of eyes, that my tenure with Global Connect had really been a cleaning role, a setting the first steps towards the transformation, the harmonization, and so on. And they wanted to get a set of fresh eyes to take a look at that. And as immensely painful as it was personally, it was the right thing to do.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that. I mean, how do you handle a situation like that? You said, I mean, I'm glad you shared it.
When they told me before I left that meeting, I said, there are two things about that I want to say. One is, I will not hide sort of the personal journey, because there is no way that I'm going to open this door and say, oh, we've had an amicable separation, blah, 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 because everybody knew that I had Global Connect blue blood in my oars. And I said, nobody's going to believe that. And personally, I hate that when you see it on LinkedIn, like blah, 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 and you're like, blah, right? So I didn't want to do that. And there was agreement with the whole management team and so on and so forth that we were going to tell the honest story. You know what? Jacob is leaving. We're doing a reorg. That's just it. Jacob is super sad. We're happy that for the time that he's been here, and, you know, just an honest story. The other thing is they asked if I wanted to stay in a transition period to help the new CIO getting started. And it was just a month, which was unfortunately, and I highlight unfortunately, super pleasant experience. The new CIO at Global Connect, MJ as she's called, fantastic person. And the unfortunate thing is, now I was super bummed that I wouldn't get to work with her, right? But you know, be that as it may, obviously I was a co-owner of the company and so on and so forth. So I left, and also in agreement with my family, after 27 years and just a lot of work, it was really a great time to take a pause.
And did it affect your sort of personal view of yourself? I mean, you've been a very, very successful project. How does that?
I think, and I have to say this both about the management team, but also EQT as the owners, everybody was super gracious. Everybody was crystal clear that this was an org change and so on and so forth. We didn't start having any stupid discussions about why him and not me, or why her and not me, so on and so forth. And I have to say, and I said this to my wife the day I came home after that, is this thing about getting a fresh set of eyes on a problem. I've said this 100 times.
Yeah, you've been saying,
I've been saying this, and you know what? It's absolutely justified. Yeah. It's absolutely justified in this, and the board did the right thing and so on. Yeah. And nobody is above the company. Nobody is above the company. We have shareholders, we have owners, we have other employees that are dependent on the management team doing the right thing, and it was the right thing to do.
And so what did you do? This is really what we're aiming for, because there's so much I want to ask you good now.
To me, this was really an opportunity to do a bunch of things. I think one thing was to go on sort of a little bit of a soul searching, or not a little bit, but soul searching.
How do you do that?
To me, it was meditation, it was reading a lot of books, it was sort of tapping into, and it's going to sound woo, but it's really not, because there are lots of methodologies to do this, but really tapping into what is your purpose? What do you want to accomplish at this point? I left Global Connect not having to work ever again, but I want to work again, because being part of a team, being part of a management team, being part of creating something is something that now that I'm done with that, and I don't know that I'll ever be done, but now that I've taken the big bulk of sort of this soul searching, it's evident that that is something that I relish.
Yeah.
Okay,
I think you're right about it. I think stop working is life is going to be quickly horrible.
Yeah,
I'm sure about that.
But that was my step number one, and I was sort of clear that I needed to do that before I started doing other things. Now, what I'm doing...
How long does that take? I mean, is it like a week or a month? I mean, how did you sort of...
No, I worked with a professional therapist, and after 3 months, I came to her and I said, "Oh, this is great, I'm done." And she said, "Hell no." So it's difficult to say. It's probably 3-4 months as a rule of thumb, but, and I can underline the but, Global Connect was so hard-coded into me that I probably needed a little more deprogramming. And also the personal relationships that you build over, I was just there for nearly 4 years, so it wasn't longer than that, but still, when you've worked with people and you've amassed the amount of hours that we had and the accomplishments that we had, and the failures too, to be honest, I needed some deprogramming for sure. But this led to a very explicit decision that I would like to work again, but not in telecommunications. And this is a link between my personal passion for the environment, for climate, decarbonization, call it whatever you want, but really facilitating this green transition. That is what I would like to work with.
Stort tack Jacob, tack för det här samtalet, den uppskattas mycket. Nästa vecka har vi något helt annat, men väldigt lägligt faktiskt. Vi har 2 avsnitt som spelades in förra veckan, när Trump vevade som mest vad det gäller DEI-frågan, det vill säga att han håller på att avskaffa hela arbetet kring diskriminering och inclusion i USA och vad det får för följd. Och då hade jag som tur var 2 uppbokade poddar med dels Aron Kron, också känd som Black Batman, bara det, ett bra namn, och sen var det faktiskt så här Inmas från Samtal, som också hade väldigt kloka insikter kring de här frågorna. Så 2 spännande avsnitt mitt i tiden kan man säga, som verkligen är för er som just nu inom rekrytering och tech funderar vad det här får för följd det här. Hur ska man tänka? Varför är det viktigt? Hur ska man agera? Mycket intressant tycker jag. Så att 2 kloka och bra personer som är på gång här framöver.